Attention, please. Now we are going to start with the first session. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first session of our STEAMed conference, focusing on the profound theme of Himalayan ecology, fragility and resilience. Today we embark on a journey to unravel the intricate tapestry that defines the delicate, equipoise and robust fortitude of the Himalayan ecosystem. Throughout this session, we will delve deep into the nuanced dynamics that delineate both the vulnerability and the extraordinary adaptability of this unparalleled environment. Our discourse for this session will encompass a wide spectrum of subjects, ranging from the profound impacts of climate change to the imperatives of biodiversity preservation, from the wisdom embedded in indigenous knowledge systems to the imperatives of sustainable development practices. Let us harness the wealth of collective expertise and the kaleidoscope of diverse perspectives present in this session as we endeavor to cultivate a profound understanding of how best to safeguard and nurture this vital ecosystem for generations to come. Now, I would like to request our STEAM chair, Venerable Professor Kaveri Gill, along with our distinguished speakers, Professor Suresh Babuji, Professor Sudha Vasan, Professor Philippe Cullet, and Ms. Manshi Asarji, please come to the dais and take your respective seats. Thank you. Now I would like to request our chair, Venerable Professor Kaveri Gill, to proceed with this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zambala. So welcome to you all. So in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce each speaker and we hear from all of them because we have a very interesting set of papers. And then, we can have some time for Q&A and also at the end. So we begin with Professor Suresh Babu, who is a professor at the School of Human Ecology, Ambedkar University. He has taught at undergraduate and postgraduate programs for the past 20 years. He's been a scientist in the Centers of Excellence program of the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, previous to his joining full-time academia. Primarily trained in natural sciences, his research interests presently include social ecological systems, trans-Himalayan region in particular, urban ecology, conservation biology, and restoration ecology. And I'm very grateful because he's come off a long train journey. So thank you, Suresh, and over to you.
Thank you, Kaveri. Very good morning to everyone. I'm really grateful to the organizers, Tibet House, and Shiv Nadar for putting this together so quickly, which also means that I don't have a very detailed presentation, except there are pointers and things which I think can be picked up as our conversation goes forward. What I hope to do is that I'm primarily from the natural sciences. My training is in ecology. So my perspective on looking at the Trans-Himalayas, pastoralism, particularly with my group of researchers who work in southern Ladakh, Changsang, in Spiti, and in Sikkim. These are the three locations where our researchers have been working. So what I'm saying, or what I hope to make an intervention on, would be based on the kind of insights that have come in over the last 10 years in particular. So I would expect to open up on some of these things in the Q&A section. Otherwise, it's a fairly brief presentation. Now, these are things most of us know, but I will still want to refocus on some of these elements because we use words, all kinds of words, particularly natural scientists come up with all kinds of words, endangered, critically endangered, right? Fragile, these kinds of words are used quite often. So it will be useful for us to also have a sense of what kind of ecology we are really dealing with. Most of you do have a sense of Trans-Himalayas. The key characteristics include, of course, aridity, and the elevations frequently are over 4,000 meters, 3,500 meters in most locations. And the Trans-Himalayas have a very unique geomorphological scenario. It's not even same across the Trans-Himalayas, very specific geological, geomorphological context in different parts of Trans-Himalayas. Another thing that I want to sort of mention here is that the soils are also equally very peculiar in the Trans-Himalayan region. It's not like one kind of soil across the whole area. As a result of these parameters, primarily based on climate and geomorphology, you have a particular ecosystem that exists in the Trans-Himalayas, which includes the particular kind of vegetation and the fauna that grows there. Now, since my focus is the way I'm looking at the ecology of Trans-Himalayas is primarily in conjunction with pastoral practice. So I want to also bring in what is the sense from where I'm seeing pastoralism. So one thing I want to sort of say that if I look at it from an anthropological lens, from an ecological lens, we need to understand that pastoralism has evolved or emerged as a biocultural adaptation to a landscape with sparse productivity. So there is very little primary productivity in the landscape, and it is dispersed all over. So if I were to try to live off that productivity, it won't be possible. So how do the pastoralists manage to do that? They manage to do that by harvesting that primary productivity spread over perhaps hundreds of square kilometers in the bodies of the animals, right? So therefore pastoralism, pastoral practice as we understand it, is a complex biocultural adaptation to a landscape ridden with sparse primary productivity. So that's something I wanted to put across very straight. So in response to the specific locations in my focus is Trans-Himalayas, but it is applicable to other locations as well. There is a livestock portfolio that the pastoralists have, right? So in Trans-Himalayas, you have a variety of animals. The iconic being the yaks and the sheep, and now the Pashmina goats and so on and so forth. There's also these yak cow hybrids, we call them Zomo and so on, right? And then there is also in some areas, there are also camels, right? Nubra Valley, for instance, there's other places. There's also several places you have horses. There is a Chumur breed. There are certain breeds of horses that are also specific to this particular region. Another important ingredient of pastoral practice, pastoralism in Trans-Himalaya is mobility. Now, different kinds of mobilities are there. As some of you would know, there is nomadic pastoralism, there's transhumant, and there's also agro-pastoralism. There are different kinds of pastoral practices that are there. But in all these pastoral practices, mobility is key. And if you look at it ecologically, it's quite a straightforward thing. Why is mobility so critical? Because after all, like we said, the productivity is very limited. It is episodic. So the animals need to move to another location. If they are not mobile, they are going to exhaust not just the biological productivity that exists, but also the regenerative potential of that landscape. So this is inbuilt in pastoralism in this particular region. The herds move from point to point, and it is a very sort of a critical ingredient of pastoral practice. Now, these are points I might open up further, so I wanted to be very clear what I'm actually referring to. This production system, if you want to think of it as a production system, you have obviously dairy, some of it like cheese, for instance, is traded, and then there is the wool and the meat and so on and so forth. Pastoralism in Trans-Himalaya is also coupled with something else, which is trade, and trade not just in livestock per se. I mean, you buy and sell as your herd size increases, but there is also a trade of products. Now, here what is interesting is, which is something I wanted to pick up a little later on, is that sheep wool, yak wool, and pashmina are like very key ingredients of this particular form of pastoralism in Trans-Himalaya. Now, there's also other things. So, for instance, southern Ladakh, where we used to work, we continue to work there. Erstwhile, this was also a site for the Sokar region, for instance. The salt is also another commodity that was traded across the border, and it's something that is required for also the health of the livestock. The salt licks are necessary for the animals themselves. Now, the last point that I want to sort of make here is that pastoralism in this region, based on archaeological records itself, is at least 4,000 years old, or perhaps more, right? Now, this is enough time. So my fraternity, for instance, ecologists, would not be very happy with what I'm going to say, is that the nature itself that you see in Trans-Himalayas has co-evolved in response to the presence of pastoral practice. So the species that you see, the animals that you see in Trans-Himalayas, it is impossible to sort of make a statement that, they are mere, there's a particular kind of resource management regime that is in place for 4,000 years, and the flora and fauna has not responded to it. That's absolutely not going to be the case. So in other words, the vegetation, the flora, the fauna that is seen in Trans-Himalaya, one way or the other, has come up in response to pastoral practice. In other words, they are connected. It's not they're not decoupled. I would like to bring up this again a little bit. So one way to therefore look at the pastoralism and the ecology of Trans-Himalayan region is to see them as coupled social ecological systems. This is a particularly useful framework for a scenario like this, because two reasons. When you say systems, you need to have a notion of isolation from the environment, and the Trans-Himalayas being so high and quite isolated from the fluxes from the rest of the world, it's conceptually sort of possible to see them as social ecological systems. Now the point here is that so if we just sort of look at this a little bit more in detail, so in this particular, what are the key ingredients that I visualize here? On one side, there is the pastoral practice, and then there is the soil and geomorphology, of course, and the climate, which triggers, which is a key ingredient of this social ecological system. So you may have a particularly high precipitation one year, triggering more biomass, and could actually nudge the pastoralists to keep more animals. So it's seamlessly connected. And a particularly harsh winter where you have sub 30 degree temperatures for a couple of weeks, it could trigger a lot of loss of livestock, and in the subsequent year there would be less pressure on the grazing areas and so on. So in other words, there's a full connection, feedback loops between the pastoral system, the vegetation, the soil nutrients, and so on. So I don't know whether I'm able to transmit that, but the idea is to visualize the whole thing as a social ecological system, all these parts being coupled with each other. Now I have another little heuristic here. The people who read systems, etc., would be familiar with this. So these social ecological systems can be imagined to have the system itself can be imagined to have a certain amount of stability. So the usual way to visualize this would be to think of a ball in a cup or a ball in a saucer kind of model, where this system can take perturbations. So you have fluctuations in precipitation, temperature, etc. It can take some amount of perturbations, and it will just stay. The overall functioning of the SES would remain in the same basin, and we can call them as stability basins, etc. But there could be qualitative changes if these perturbations cross certain thresholds. That's the way you can visualize SES. Now, if I go a little bit further, I just wanted to sort of add some color here by producing a list of changes that we have observed, and this is also published by several groups, including ours, changing pastoral practices in Trans-Himalaya. Now, I'll come back to this SES idea in a bit. One of the things that we see is a changing livestock composition. And what does that change? We see the change primarily pushing towards an expansion in Pashmina goats. Now, Pashmina goats are a particular kind of animal, and the reduction in the portfolio, as I said earlier, from you have yaks, you have several other kinds of animals. It is directly in response to what's the demand in the market. So in Changtang, for instance, if a kilo of yak wool is 100 rupees, you have Pashmina selling at 1500, 2000, 1300 rupees per kg on the spot in the field where it is getting picked up. That's a huge incentive. So anybody who's aspiring for an iPhone obviously will, like, the push is very clear, and there are all kinds of incentives that are there for doing away with the other animals which are seen to be now less productive, and it's almost seen as a burden, and shifting completely to Pashmina. In many locations that we see, there's an actual increase in the livestock holdings, overall holdings on one side, but also predominantly it is shifting 70%, 80%. People are now shifting to Pashmina goats. Now, Pashmina goat is a particular kind of animal which has got a certain amount of tolerance to extreme temperatures and conditions and so on. So, on one side, there is commercialization, market linkages, which is pushing the livestock composition in one particular direction. Then there is the other thing, which is sedentarization, which is quite common all across Trans-Himalaya. Now there is a lot of push. You can see the settlements have now become permanent settlements. If you look at a place like Thukje in Sokar, you have Pakka houses that have come up, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. I think Professor Siddiq remarked earlier, I mean, when you ask this question as to, why should I not have a permanent shelter? I mean, that's a hard one to sort of deal with. But there is an active sort of effort to sedentarize. Hand pumps have been given, infrastructure has been provided in locations there which were otherwise camps. There is a massive change in their mobility patterns. Now, this is very interesting because it's because of 2-3 reasons. One is, of course, infrastructure projects, military projects, and very interestingly, conservation projects, biodiversity conservation projects. So there are parts of Trans-Himalaya that are now not accessible for grazing, or grazing is restricted, and people are not allowed to take their animals in certain areas. That is affecting their mobility patterns. Another reason why their mobility patterns are getting affected is because the herders themselves are not the traditional herders. So that's a very interesting element, which is the next idea, which is there's a lot of absentee pastoralism going on, which means that the people who traditionally own the rights to keep the livestock are in Leh, for instance, and there is actually labor which is hired hands from Leh going to Changtang to graze. So there is a counter migration. I mean, there's urbanization and people flocking to the cities, but there is also a reverse migration because Pashmina is so it's much more, it's probably much more valuable. Is that's actually reverse migration to, I'll probably just take one more minute. So these are all very interesting things that are going on, and of course with effects on traditional social institutions that otherwise traditionally used to regulate the number of livestock and also resolve conflicts between groups, the Goba system, for instance. These institutions are systematically becoming weaker. There are overlaps with other mechanisms, etc. We all know, actually, there are several examples from our studies in Sikkim, for instance. What happens when grazing is restricted? It changes the vegetation composition, it changes the soil nutrient, and so on and so forth. We have also examples from the Valley of Flowers, for instance, where this particular plant, it just exploded. If you go to Valley of Flowers right now, 70% or 60% of the area will be just this, and it's a native species, but its numbers have gone up in response to grazing having been restricted. To connect this, I'll take it back to the previous thing I said, that if these systems are indeed 3,000, 4,000 years old, the species composition that we see must have come up in response to the pastoral practices. So decoupling them overnight is not going to be a great idea. Then we, of course, have human-wildlife conflict or coexistence. I prefer to say coexistence. Here, people would say conflict mostly. I think I'll not be able to pick on that. If there are questions, I'll come back here. So what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of these, whether it is commercialization, development practices, infrastructure, tourism and waste management, we have actually just wrapped up one study which is in review right now, where we are seeing that as such, the soils are nutrient poor. So there's hardly any carbon, nitrogen, and it's very patchy. So what we are seeing is that in Sokar region, for instance, we are observing that the tourism brings in a lot of nutrient loading into the system. So there's a lot of carbon and nitrogen pools that are being created around sites where you have these Maggie shops and so on and so forth. So it is, so things that we do, whether it is, we call it ecotourism, whatever, once it is crossing certain kinds of threshold, they are not benign at all. So we're making a lot of, we're making dents on this social ecological system. Perhaps we can see some instances of decoupling all this. So I'll close by saying, I think if I'll close by saying that when we are touching on any part of these social ecological systems, there is a need to exercise great restraint, because there's no way to tell exactly what's going to happen. There are large number of studies which indicate that the outcomes are usually loss of resilience and adaptive capacity, and these areas obviously are the most climate vulnerable societies in the country, at least. What it's characteristic of such SES, such complex systems, that when we do these kinds of perturbations, the state changes and surprises and shocks usually are part and package of such systems. So when we are tinkering with such social ecological systems, we need to exercise restraint. So I'll close here. If there are questions, I'll come back later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh, for that very powerful and succinct presentation, and you've covered a lot of ground. We'll just move on to the next presentation so we can have some time for Q&A. And so our next speaker is Professor Sudha Vasan, who's a professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. She received her doctorate from Yale University in the year 2000 and has held research and teaching positions at Yale University, London School of Economics, Australian National University, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla, Institute of Economic Growth, and Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, before joining DU in 2006. She teaches and writes on political ecology with a focus on how gender, caste, class, and indigeneity intersect with ecology and environmentalism. Her published work spans themes such as environment as a meta-narrative, ecological crisis and the logic of capital, experiencing neoliberal nature, and ethnography of the forest guard. She has published in international and national journals such as the Journal of Development Studies, Journal of Developing Societies, Economic and Political Weekly, Sociological Bulletin, Journal of Human Ecology. Her book titled Living with Diversity, Forestry Institutions in the Western Himalaya was published in 2007 by the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla. And again, I'm really grateful to Sudha, who came back early from her holidays to be here today. That's a big deal for academics, so I'm very grateful.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Tibet House and all of you for being here on a Sunday. And thank you specifically to Anila for reaching out to me to be a part of this panel. You actually caught me at a time when I was back doing field work after many years. I do field work in the mid-Himalayas, really, looking at Himachal Pradesh in particular, the region just below, at the tree line and below the tree line, right? So that is really that's been my area field for the last 25 years or so. And this summer, after a long time, given the pandemic and other constraints, I was actually going back to these places and to the families and the farmers with whom I had done research since the 1990s. So I've been in touch, and this is again a region that I've been going back and looking at the change. And as I heard both the concept note that Anila had put together, but also the first plenary that happened, I really thought these are exactly the questions that were bothering me as I was traveling through this region in the last in the last month or so. So what I'm doing here is really trying to understand what farmers are affected by, how are they making their decisions, and especially since I was working in the Kullu region, a region that faced a phenomenal flood, a flash flood last year around the same time, the beginning of July, that actually washed out many of the orchards and farms, and of course, people's lives and the urban infrastructure that has been built. So I was really interested in how farmers are looking at this kind of change. How are they dealing with it? I was interested in farmers because over the years I've been looking a lot at the environment. I've been looking at forests, I've been looking at forest rights, traditional institutions. But what I went back to this year was really something that's fundamental, I think, to the livelihoods and the self-identity of the people of the region, and that is agropastoralism. As Suresh pointed out, this is something that has been carried out in this region of the Himalayas for thousands of years. These are communities that have been farming in these what can from a plains perspective be seen as a very difficult conditions. But on the other hand, these are also communities that really see this as home. So the kind of step irrigation that you see, I'll move on to some slides where you'll see some of that. This is just to give you where I was located this summer. This is Kullu district, Himachal Pradesh, really just below the tree line. And what you see here are communities that are involved that have been for thousands of years cultivating these lands, cultivating in a kind of agro-pastoral livelihood, which really includes food crops, but also livestock of various types. And this now has been substantially supplemented in terms of cash income by tourism. So in the last few years, I've been going back and looking at household incomes. And one of the things that you find is that in terms of sheer income and people investing in the education of the next generation, I think, I would agree that education is really what people are thinking of and looking in terms of development. And in particular, that's an intergenerational investment. So you have incomes that are coming from tourism or agropastoralism that is being invested in young people who then come to universities like ours, including ones like Delhi, because the education quality, of course, is very, very centralized in a place like India. So what I was looking at this summer is going back and looking at those who are still invested in agriculture rather than those who are who are involved in tourism. One of the things that has happened in the region across the Himalayas, but I give you data from case studies in the mid-Himalayas, looking at Kullu district, is that there is a huge shift in agriculture from subsistence cropping, even up to the 90s, and food crops into the late 90s, to what are entirely now cash crops. This does not mean people don't cultivate for themselves. There are small fields that people might be cultivating, but the move for agriculture has been towards cash income. So agriculture now is definitely not the agriculture that is there even in the 90s in the Himalayas, because agriculture is, like tourism, about cash income. Of course, unlike tourism, agriculture has a particular ecological relationship with the mountains, and therefore it's something that I think we should look at very, very carefully. So the region I'm looking at now cultivates vegetables in a big way, and interestingly, not vegetables that are part of the local diet. So you're really cultivating, well, this tomato and capsicum and vegetables like that, but you can also see there's a lot of broccoli and cauliflower that is being cultivated there. A lot of these are highly intensive agriculture for a mountain region with drip irrigation and fertilization and pesticide being sprayed on them and things like that. It's also closely integrated, if you look at the fields here, with horticulture. So this is a region that did have apples in the past, but not the kind of quality apples that you get from even Kashmir or the higher altitude. So you have apples, but you also have now a huge market for plums and pears and apricots. So all of these now have shifted from an earlier 90s period when these were fruits, these are again fruits that were always grown in this region, perhaps, including things like persimmon, but were really low intensive production, which means that there were trees in the forests, including things like apricots and walnuts, which were really trees in the forest that were providing these outputs, to now what is intensive cultivation across the Himalayas. I think this is a pattern that we need to remember when we're looking at agrarian transition in the region. In the last 20 years, I think this agrarian transition has been significant. One of the things that is happening in the region is also a diversity of crops that are being grown. So although every field might be a monoculture, across the region, what you actually find are farmers actually investing in ensuring that they have a variety of agriculture and horticultural projects. I'll come to why in a minute. I do look at it as an important adaptation strategy as well. So what you have is maybe 9 varieties of plums, for instance, just in one small valley of Kullu, several varieties of kiwi, persimmon, and you find pears, plums, all of those. What you also have is new adaptive varieties, right? Some of this is, of course, coming from outside. In fact, with the fruit region of the Himalayas, in Himachal Pradesh in particular, unlike in Uttarakhand, you actually have a lot of investment into research in improving agriculture and horticulture in particular. You also have a lot of private investment now into horticulture. So we actually have new varieties of apples coming in, of course, in a World Bank project that is bringing in new varieties of apples that can be grown in places where the weather is warmer than what you would anticipate, what you would expect for older varieties of apples. A lot of this is also happening along with changes in weather patterns in the region. So one of the things that almost all the farmers that I met during the last 2 months told me was their intense awareness of changing weather, changing climate, of the warming, of the sort of shifting patterns of rain in the region, the months in which it rains, and the general increase in temperature where you do not have snowfall in the time that it used to happen well into, let's say, even up to 2000. So in the last 20 years, I think for local people, again, when we think of local knowledge, there's an intense awareness, I think, among farmers about climate change and changing patterns of weather. I'm also saying this as an academic because often people think there's a need to educate people about climate change. There is in certain ways, but what I find is that farmers are very, very aware of this transition that is happening. But decision making cannot be affected only by this awareness, and that is where I'm going to come to one of the small points that I really want to make in this talk, in this discussion with you, that farmers' decisions are actually affected substantially by market fluctuation. And both looking at the large-scale data, which I did a little bit of this summer, but also in the farmer case studies, it was clear that in case after case, the decisions that farmers were making regarding what would go into their land was affected much more by market fluctuation than it was by climate fluctuation. And I just wanted to show you market fluctuation. It's substantial. This is just 2010 to 2022. Apple production in the valley just shifts substantially. But one of the things that farmers told me is that this shift is not simply to do with climate changes. I think a lot of studies talk about the climate, the apple belt moving higher up in the Himalayas, the belt of vegetables moving up. But farmers' explanation of a graph like this was really that the market fluctuation is substantial. So tomatoes, for instance, 2 years ago, sold at something like 20 rupees a crate. And the last year, even given the floods and the substantial loss of property and life that they had, and substantial loss of landscape that they had, the rates for tomatoes were actually shot up to 120. Which meant that last year, even though there was such a huge climate problem, those who were able to get their tomatoes to the market actually made a profit compared to the previous year when the weather patterns were normal, but because of the high production of tomatoes, the market rates really fell. I think we need to take into account this kind of integration into capitalism and markets that has happened in the Himalayas. So apple production, again, that's just one fruit. The previous graph had several fruits. You can see for almost all the fruits, there's really no saying how much is going to be, how much of the production is going to reach the market in a particular year. In terms of what's happened between the 90s and 2024 in the small valley of Kullu, what you find is that farmers are constantly shifting crops, right? This again can be seen as an adaptation. And a lot of studies would look at it as an adaptation to climate because there were apples in the region, stone fruits, plums and pears were there already in the 80s and the 90s. And then you find suddenly in around 2000, all the farms, there are farmers who are actually digging up their trees, removing their old apple trees because the apples are not producing, but moving to tomatoes, peas, and garlic. And you also find that by 2015 to 20, there's new plum varieties that are being planted, the 8-9 varieties that I spoke about. And in the last 5 years, there seems to be a shift to new varieties of apples again. So the old apples were actually taken out of their farms, planted with vegetables. Now we're going back to apples and persimmon in particular, which really you can go up to some valleys of Kullu and you see entire hillsides planted with persimmon, right? So this kind of shift, though, it's a complex shift that is happening partly in response to fallen productivity. But significantly, if you talk to farmers, it's happening in response to market changes. There is now higher rates for persimmon, and farmers are moving to planting their fields with this. Again, there's a glut that will happen in 5 to 10 years where there's too much production of persimmon in this valley. It's no longer viable, and you find it going down. So this, in fact, is common knowledge in the valley, but there's very little sort of, Okay, so there's very little kind of understanding of how the market actually intervenes in the way people react to climate and weather changes. That is a point that I want to make. It's not so much, 2 minutes, I'll be done. Thank you. So I did want to point out something that I said. I won't go into this at the moment, that farmers are very, very aware of the kind of ecological impact that is happening in the hills. It's impossible to not be aware if you're actually living in these mountains because you experience it on an everyday basis. So there's very high awareness of climate effects, but climate does not affect only production and ecosystems. Climate affects production of the crop, of course, but climate affects transport in a very big way, and climate also affects prices in the local region. So this kind of complex seems to affect how farmers actually respond to risk. And one of the things that came up again and again in this new fieldwork that I've been doing is that the risk of the market is really what is bothering farmers across the Himalayas. And the point that I want to make in terms of where do we go from this is that capitalism, I think, is now totally entrenched across the Himalayas. We often talk about other things, traditional knowledge of climate changes, but I think this idea of capitalism and the aspirations, again, the aspirations that we're talking about is also a part of a capitalist system, and we really need to think about what our response is going to be to the risk brought about by this. And one of the points about capitalism and risk is that risk is always individualized. So individual farmers across the Kullu Valley are making decisions about what crops they need to plant, which is resulting in perhaps each farmer then making that decision to plant persimmon now or in the last 5 years. But collectively, 5 years down the line, we're going to see a glut of persimmon and really farmers facing a huge loss. So, okay, I'm not going to get into those. So climate and market, I want to point out, are actually inseparable in terms of their impact on the Himalaya. And in terms of praxis, at least, if we want to talk about what to do, we would have to address the issue of capitalism in the Himalayas if we want to deal with climate and change. These are very quickly, I'll just take 1 minute to tell you what these are. For instance, the fruit that is there, the pomegranate, is heavily sprayed in the Himalayas. And the spraying happens every 10 days, every 15 days. And the reason is the market requires the perfect red-colored, smooth-skinned fruit, right? Nobody in the region eats pomegranates because they know it's so unhealthy. So farmers are very aware, but the market results in this kind of thing. You find that a lot of the traditional water sources are actually dry. This particular area, this is dry because the hydel projects in the region, there's been a whole lot of tunneling. And as soon as the projects came, about 5 years after the tunneling, traditional sources have died down. Farmers adapt by getting into other forms of irrigation, drip irrigation, and things like that. And there, of course, you find Italian varieties of apples that have come in, that are spur varieties, quick, again, the compression of time, something that we know about capitalism. I think Suresh, Babu's presentation about how, you over a long period of time, biomass gets accumulated in the animal. Capitalism doesn't wait so long. Profits need to be faster, quicker, so the time cycles are shorter. So what I want to present before you is that Himalayan agrarian societies, people who are invested in sort of cultivating the land there, is actually in a significant state of transition now. So the agrarian transition is really about the integration into capitalism. And I think we need to think about, what we can do about such planetary problems, given that risk in capitalism is always individualized. So unless we can think of collectivization of risk, whether you think of the state or you think of other forms of collectivization, I think that is really one direction that I see that we would have to move to if we want to deal with climate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudha. Fantastic. This panel is really cohering and such brilliant papers. Our next speaker is Professor Philippe Cullet. He's a professor of international and environmental law at SOAS University of London, a visiting professor at the National Law University Delhi, and professor in residence at the National Law University Meghalaya. His forthcoming books are the Oxford Handbook of Environmental and Natural Resources Law in India with OUP, forthcoming next month, co-edited with Loveleen Bhullar and Sujit Kunan, and River Rejuvenation and River Rights, Evolving Debates in India with Orient Black Swan, forthcoming next year, and co-edited with Ruchi Sri. So thank you to Philippe, who's also come down from Shillong.
Thank you. Okay, I'll put a timer to try and be timely. Okay, so when I was trying to reflect on the concept note and thinking what it is that I could contribute here, I was actually thinking, as the director pointed in the morning, about where can we find some rays of hope? Because if we say environmental justice and the kind of issues, okay, many of them have already been pointed this morning. There is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily look like we have ways forward in the existing context. So starting from the need for change, from the existing, okay, yeah, starting from sustainable development, because that was part of the concept note. I'll try to highlight one of the ways in which we can move forward, which is that new river rights or ecocentric rights discourse, which is now increasingly widespread. It's only one of many options. There may be, even just in terms of conceptual thinking, there are lots of issues that can be discussed with the rights model itself. But it's the idea of trying to bring something new to the table to the extent that we can do something different. Okay, so very briefly, starting with sustainable development and environmental justice, I guess the introduction here is that, and we just heard this with Sudha's presentation as well, everything has been and remains framed in terms of economic growth as the main driver of what we understand as sustainable at this point. And this harps back to that framing we've had for now at least 3.5, soon 4 decades of so-called trying to integrate environment and development, which clearly has entirely failed. That's not limited to the Himalayas, but much more broadly. Now, one of the things that came with sustainable development was that recognition of the need for equity, because there was a lot of emphasis at first on intergenerational equity, which is great, but which cannot be our main point of focus if intra-generational equity has not come first. That's the first point of tension that I guess we have in terms of achieving something called environmental justice. And one of the other things we had was the focus on poverty, which maybe we want to extend to marginal communities, individuals, which has remained as an entry point, but as we know, the results have not been in line with expectations. Now, within that context, what is it that environmental justice brings to a concept of sustainable development? Among the many things that we could highlight, one of them is a focus on the collective dimension of environmental harms, and we were just hearing about the individual dimension of risk, so that's exactly one of these things. In terms of rights, we have the same problem of a very strong focus on the individual rights that remains up to today. And within that, some of the things that we've had is an emphasis on rights as a way to foster environmental justice, but typically a trajectory over the past few decades that has led to much more of a focus on the procedural dimensions of justice rather than the substantive aspects. Within that broader framework, one of the things that stands out, but that was not part of the framing of discussion for a long time, I think there have been lots of critique of sustainable development for a long time, but one of the ones that has only emerged over the past 10, 15 years is the focus on anthropocentric understanding of the environment as part of the very framing of sustainable development itself. Now, just to take one example of how that pans out in practice, just taking the example of different types of natural resources. So in Uttarakhand, just very brief entry point examples to move to the next example. As the reason why it's Uttarakhand is because my river rights example is also Uttarakhand. There is no other reason. I'm sure we could take any other example otherwise. In terms of natural resources, the Chipko movement, which we know, which we understand as a very successful start to a different type of ecology from the 70s onwards. One of the long-term things that happened is, for instance, stronger environmental protection framings, as we heard earlier, leading to even lesser access in terms of rights, customary rights and practices to the natural resources concerned, so the forest and all the other natural resources, either as sources of livelihood or meeting basic needs. Second dimension is water, and that's also because of the focus on river rights. One of the interventions is dams, or one of the controversial interventions in terms of sustainable development and environmental justice is dams. One of the reasons in terms of sustainable development is providing electricity and drinking water, for instance, to large cities like this city. And then, on the other hand, the increasing understanding that dams per se do not fit within the ecologies that we have where they're built. So the twin problem of, in this case, interstate dimension of what is sustainable development and what fulfills or contributes to fulfilling environmental justice, and the broader framing around that. Now, in terms of the responses that have been given, we've had environmental protection measures that have been around for the past 50 years or so, at least in the name of the environment. There was more before, but not in the name of the environment. One of the things that we all often like to say is that the failure has been a failure of implementation and enforcement of the measures that have been adopted, and obviously that is one of the factors that we need to take into account. But there is also an underlying failure which has been there, has been known, but is only starting to be effectively discussed and possibly addressed, is that the fact that those environmental protection measures that were taken were really taken in a context of a focus on an anthropocentric understanding of nature, that idea of nature being used or useful to development in different ways. So one of the things is sustainable development being framed around economic growth, being the driver of better environmental outcomes, which by now we know has not worked out. Second is the anthropocentric framing of understanding nature as something to be used by us as a species. And the third, among other things that could be pointed, but just to point one more thing, is the focus on property rights and the specific issues that we have with a strong focus in terms of land rights in many parts on individual rights, which stop us from understanding nature or the environment in terms of the collective goods and collective harms that take place, and also in terms of, let's say, providing for protection at ecosystem level, at aquifer level, whatever of these broader dimensions that we need to consider, which also we've heard a lot about in the two previous presentations. Now, in terms of what is it that's been projected over the past few years as new thinking, and again, there could be different thinking, but that's one which is visible in the public sphere at present, so that's why I'm bringing it here, is those two decisions of the Uttarakhand High Court in 2017, giving legal personality to Ganga and Yamuna. So it's specific to that state, but since Ganga is not only an interstate, but also a transboundary river, obviously it's something that can allow us to have a much broader discussion around questions of environmental justice and sustainable development. Interestingly, there were two decisions. The first one just focused on the rivers themselves. The second one extended the protection and the understanding of the need for protection to the whole catchment, so-called from the glaciers to the springs, the forest, everything that makes up the river in the end. So probably making it a lot more interesting for us in terms of a broader understanding of the ecology. In one way, and in the way in which the High Court addresses the problem, it's really looking at the whole problem of pollution, destruction of the river, deaths of the river, and trying to give a new answer, which is in fact what they do on that day. They're trying to admonish the government for not having done what they were supposed to do again in the context of an earlier order in the same case. So it's really a way to, in very practical term, in a way, to get back at the government and say you have not done what you were supposed to do in terms of the environmental protection measures that we all understand, the environmental laws that have been enforced for many decades. You really need to think of these issues in a different way, in a way the way in which that came through. So here the idea of the legal personality is to say that instead of that model of integration, we need to move towards something which clearly gives priority to nature, which obvious somewhere, but which has never been achieved in terms of the mainstream thinking around sustainable development, or the kind of sustainable development that has been implemented in policy and in practice for several decades. At the same time, interestingly, and that probably is something that could be discussed much further, while this comes as an ecocentric, and there is possibly something around an opposition between ecocentric and anthropocentric, the court and most of the debates we've had around these issues of river rights or rights of nature have clearly understood that it's about giving priority to nature, but realizing and recognizing that there are people living in those environments and that we can't exclude. So we are much more in a context that was discussed before of biocultural rights rather than a form of absolute conservationism, which in some other international debates, there may be some doubts as to what's happening. What is it at which state are we, and where do we need to move forward? Those two decisions of granting personality to the rivers were stayed. There is an appeal that's been pending in the Supreme Court, so this is for the timing a theoretical discussion. Second point, the guardianship model that was proposed is in a way simply to transfer the power from the state to another understanding of the state. We probably need to go beyond that to be able to effect a real change in terms of the way we think about the rivers. Thirdly, there is no real framing around river-dependent people as the people who should be in charge of understanding what the rivers need, since there will always be a human hand and human eye in terms of framing those river rights discourses. Fourth, there is the problem that's probably something we've seen before of the poor or the most marginalized being seen as the problem, the cause of pollution, therefore people who may or need to be removed from the river. Five, there is the need to frame the understanding we have of river rights more solidly around a scientific understanding, which has been at the root of much of environmental protection regimes until now. But even though we need to bring in more of the social, we can't lose out the science and what the science tells us about the needs for environmental protection. Finally, there is the question of if you introduce rights, there might be obligations that arise from them. So there is that whole thing of what about if the rivers flood and cause damage to nature or human interest? Will the river be responsible for it? Clearly not. But there needs to be a conversation to ensure that we are not talking about things which then can be said to be non-implementable or which take away from the existing liability or responsibility of the actors in charge. Now, what can river rights do for us? Maybe not much, maybe a lot, possibly. The understanding is essentially that we need to be able to move from a top-down to, okay, even though I don't like the term, let's say bottom-up perspective, but really to engage with the framing in which people themselves can be in charge of the decision-making, not just in terms of consultation and participation, but as effective actors in the way in which the environment is protected and managed, which is what the last two presentations have been mostly about. One of the things that we need to engage with is the potential discrepancy between fundamental rights and rights of nature or river rights. In the decisions we have, we've been told that they are equivalent to the right of human beings. That's great because in a way that confirms that we need to engage with both simultaneously. That does not remove that there is a need for prioritizing nature, but that also should not lead to taking away from the existing fundamental rights, including the so-called right to a clean environment. So that also helps us understanding that we may need to talk about new frameworks, but that needs to be within a context where we do not take away from what already exists. Now, again, the right framework has possibly lots of challenges that it needs to address to be effective. But at the same time, one of the reasons why people go back to the right framework is because at some level, it can and sometimes does help in terms of addressing the situation of the most marginalized, including in this case of the most marginalized environment, which those high altitude environments would be part of. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Philippe, for giving us a legal perspective. And our last speaker on this panel is Manshi Ashar. Manshi is a researcher and activist based in Himachal Pradesh. For the last 2.5 decades, she has been associated with diverse organizations in documentation and advocacy on issues of environmental justice with a focus on forest, land, and water rights. In 2009, she, along with friends, co-founded Himdhara Collective, extending support and solidarity to mountain communities struggling to protect their landscapes and livelihoods. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tibet House and Professor Gill, for inviting me and giving this opportunity. Again, an opportune time because for the last 10 years, or at least since the Kedarnath tragedy happened, and very few people know that Himachal was also impacted by the floods in 2013, the Satluj Valley, which I'm going to speak about today. The upper Satluj basin was also saw floods at the time, but it did not catch media attention because it didn't have the kind of fatalities and especially impact on tourists and pilgrim tourists. And since the last decade and a half, and even as we are speaking now, some chunk of mountain is falling off somewhere. There's news of land subsidence coming from different parts of at least the western Himalaya that we've been tracking, but it's also happening in the eastern Himalaya. And we've been looking at what is the framing of this Himalayan disasters. And it's very much in the context of also the climate crisis. And what we've found is that there are some common narratives that we see repeated in the Himalayan disaster framing, and the media and the government both play a very important role in this narrative. Like 2023 was a very important year. It started with the Joshimath land subsidence and sinking. Then you had the Byas floods in Himachal, which then of course affected the whole state. You had a spate of landslides, and then we had the Sikkim disaster where the Tista dam got wiped out. There was a glof, and that was followed by a disaster. And so we kind of started looking at what is happening at large, and also we decided to go in close into one terrain and one particular kind of disaster, which is landslides, and look at how people are responding to it, simply because people's narratives were not coming out or finding space in the media until recently, where social media has been a tool that a lot of impacted communities have used. But the mainstream media and the has sensationalized these narratives. So you had the Himalaya as, of course, there is the aestheticized and the tourists, gaze on the Himalaya. Then there is Himalaya as the strategic frontiers, as Claude pointed out, and now Himalaya as the disaster zones. And as fast as it is sensationalized, it is also normalized. The headlines also naturalize this disaster, that is, calling it repeatedly natural disasters. There is one is that the narratives again are very controlled by experts and rooted in very technocratic views. Climate reductionists also, because we found that in the long run that kind of helps escaping accountability and looking at very localized causes or triggers that may be involved. There's the language of unplanned development. Whereas you see there are planned infrastructures, whether it is the 4-laning or the hydropower or any other kind of tourism expansion that is happening, is very much part of central and state policy and revenue generation plan and economic growth agenda, but it's always referred to as unplanned, not looking at questions of governance, lack of regulatory mechanisms, dilution of regulatory laws, and an overall kind of a attitude towards the Himalayan region, where rescue and relief is where it ends. And even in that, if there are no fatalities, then it is highlighted as a kind of an achievement, as that which we have seen in some of the recent disasters. And Yeah, so we decided that we'd look into landslides in a place called Kinnaur, which is a high Himalayan district of Himachal Pradesh. It is on it has got in the northeast. Northeast, bordered by Tibet and Uttarakhand on one side, almost like 150 kilometers aerial distance from the upper Ganga river basin. It's the Satluj river basin, and this is an important part of the northwest Himalaya, which has almost 65% of the landslides that occur in India are concentrated here. And we decided to look at Kinnaur also because in 2021 there were two fatal landslides, one which killed tourists and the other which killed where local a bus was buried in a big rock fall, and that was followed by a youth movement called No Means No, which was against hydropower proliferation in the valley. This is a valley which has about 30 small and big hydropower projects and transmission lines also, and 4,000 megawatt just coming out of this one little district, which includes also the largest private, which was earlier JP, now Jindal, and it's a scheduled tribe area. And we decided to bring focus to the because there is a lot of, in the whole disaster management vocabulary, there's talk of risk repeatedly. Disaster risk reduction is what the policy framework is focusing on. What it entails and how it translates to ground practice, or what do local communities, how do they understand risk? And that is something that Sudha spoke about in the earlier, but we keep hearing this narrative of risk reduction. So we decided to, we've started this process of consultations across 22 villages in 3 zones. The upper zone, which is more arid and dry, and then there's the mid zone, which is more forested, and then the lower Kinnaur, which is where the density of population is larger. But this is about, the total district is about 84,000 population, and basically what we found is that I think that Suresh Babu spoke about it. If you look at the socio-ecological relationships, and if you look at the kind of people-nature interaction that has evolved historically, like you have a landscape in which the inhabitable land is only 3%, and the rest of it is non-inhabitable, but it does not mean it is not used. So historically, the kind of occupations and the kind of land use that has developed around transhuman pastoralism, trans-Himalayan trade, starting from Tibet, going up to Tibet, and then going trans-border trade, now of course stopped, and going right down to the plains of Punjab, and a multiplicity of livelihoods provided a kind of an adaptive capacity to the local communities. You have both Hindu and Buddhist practicing communities at the same time. Very local animistic deities are part of the spiritual practice in the region, and which governed day-to-day life. So there was a lot of mobility and autonomy. These two were very important aspects of life, and what we found in how we kind of try to understand about life within a hazard prone terrain. So we don't use the word disaster, but the fact that landslides have been a part of life, that there is an understanding of geology in the local language. Every village, there in the songs, in the stories, in the folklore, there are in the names of the villages, there's a distinct geographical identity, sometimes identified by the kind of soil, by the location. So there was a village called Shalkhar, which had shifted 3 times. So the agriculture fields and habitations had shifted 3 times. So the elders, and then as we went down the valley, we found the stories of shifting villages across the valley. So it is something that was part of practice. And that there was this ability to shift from one place to another in case of some kind of a calamity. In terms of architectural practice also, we found the Katkuni architecture, one earthquake prone, because this is a seismic zone 5 area. The kind of material that is used, which is mostly wood and stone, and the fact that it is a portable, the whole house can be undone and then rebuilt again, put together again. Even other kinds of if you look at, for instance, the presence of fraternal polyandry, which is seen as more of a land and labor management strategy in society. So these were, so basically what I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to separate out each of these, and they're interlinked co-evolutions that have taken place. Over time, there is a historical and gradual, erosion of these adaptive capacities and a production of risk that takes place, which begins one of the biggest ruptures that was described. And we've presented it here in a linear fashion when we talk about historically, but in the narratives or in the testimonies of the people, it was never linear. So the stoppage of trade with Tibet, or the revenue and the forest settlement, which put a stop to, which stigmatized, for instance, the access or by pastoralists, which introduced new forest laws or restrictions to movement and mobility, which took away the right to govern forest resources. So there were very specific decisions in different points in history, or even the land reforms, which were very important for the landless communities or those who were marginal holders, because they got access to land, especially the Dalits in the region. And there are scheduled castes. You don't have the 4 Varna system, but you have a very clear landed and other castes who were also doing handicrafts, weaving, etc., artisans. And then there is the coming of Apple with in the 70s being pushed as part of state policy, which brings in opportunities. So there's modernity, it brings in opportunities, but it also brings in new challenges and new vulnerabilities. And post 1990s, with the changing climate, the area under Apple goes up, because it shifts across the valley, right up to Upper Kinnaur. And then there's also loans from banks. So more people shifting to horticulture, moving out of subsistence agriculture, moving out of pastoralism. But pastoralism is not dead. There is also various kinds of pastoralism, like agropastoralism, etc. And there is the production of unequal and risks because of massive hydropower development that takes place post 2000. So a lot of the changes that are taking place, they are, historical land use changes, but like I said earlier, that they're multi-scalar processes which have impacted the resilience and created vulnerabilities. I don't want to go into the details, but here's another example of this. this whole question of multi-story constructions is spoken about repeatedly, and the fact that people are greedy and they have access to cash, so they're building these huge houses. One, the scope of horizontal expansion is less, so vertical, and they always had multi-story, because in the lower stories you had the animals, and then you have a joint family, so you have everyone living together. But the ban on timber distribution and the cheaper cement in the market also influenced these kind of building practices. The move from dry toilets to water-based toilets, leading to the problem of wastewater management, leading to subsidence and landslides again as an issue. People spoke about Har Ghar Shauchalay, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and how that has pushed for wet toilets to come in every household. So there are many layers to the kind of changes that are taking place. It's not always an individual choice, but market and state driven is what one is trying to say. So now, at present, 1,500 landslides have been documented by the DDMA, the Disaster Management Authority. And just to highlight that the fatalities are high in Kinnaur, the economic losses are extremely high. And what we find is that the landslides are concentrated in the area where the hydropower production is happening, where the hydropower projects are concentrated. So while the upper Kinnaur is supposed to be more susceptible to landslides, it's inherently considered to be geologically more dynamic and more arid and more sandy soil. The number of landslides are concentrated in lower Kinnaur, because that is where the vulnerability is higher, the population that is where all the contestation over the land is taking place, over the forest is taking place. And that's where now we see more fatalities in the landslides, more blockages of the road, because of which apple and other crops are not being able to reach the market. And so just to add again a lens of so when we are talking about landslides as disasters, one, we realize we cannot talk about each disaster separately. They're very connected with floods. So they're cascading disasters, they're complex disasters, they're compounding disasters. The displacement because of landslides is slow, it is incremental. There is, of course, incremental land use change taking place. I just want to give example of one landslide, which is in the alignment of a 1,500 megawatt power project. In that, when we tried to explore the history of that landslide, you had the military coming in. So there's militarization and the importance of the roads, etc., the setting up of the military infrastructure. So there was a military camp being set up, a community was displaced, and they were allotted land elsewhere, which is where this landslide is now. They had to cut the oak forest, which was the main grazing land and forest area of the village. They set up apple orchards over there. And then there was a road that went through that village. Then there was a flood, which was the 2000 and 2005 big Sutlej floods, the Parchu flood, which cut at the toe. And then there was the dam, which then, cuts through underneath the village. So there's gradual land use change that is taking place, and then compounding, leading to what we see as expansion of the landslide and the subsidence of the village. So just to kind of again highlight that it's not possible to study this a landslide in isolation or one single disaster as a one-off event, but that is what the current disaster mitigation and disaster management approach is. And for the community, one of the important parts of the unequal risks is that, of course, the risks are, the companies, like for instance, Natpa Jhakdi power project was affected by the floods, but it got the highest insurance claim ever, 300 crores insurance for its, so it's insulated itself from the risk. The companies are insulated from the risk. They are passed on to the people, and they have to establish the scientific correlation that landslide or a particular disaster or the crack in the houses or whatever impacts they have faced is because of the project. And in the absence of this scientific correlation, they are not eligible for compensation. So this there is first the violence of the project coming up, the violence of the disaster, and then having to lay claims for compensation. And yeah, so I'll just last slide. Sorry, I know I've gone beyond my time. This is again geopolitically fraught area, so national interest. There's, this is also part of the green energy, the transition. So there's a lot of global funding coming in, this CDM funding coming in for the hydropower projects. So there's a lot of pressure to continue building more projects, and there is resistance from community, and as a kind of an assertion where they're using their constitutional rights. There's also divine intervention, because the devtas are also involved in many of those, in the opposition to the projects. And there is also rejection of the mitigation measures, which is early warning systems. For landslides, early warning systems, plantations, and structural check walls. All three have not worked, but what people do say is that we have been giving early warnings for a long time, but our early warnings have not been paid heed to. And now you have the Apada Mitra scheme and the trainings where, now the youth clubs are boycotting the disaster management trainings, because they say that first they are causing the disasters, and then they are telling us how to put our gas cylinder in a safe way. So many of the youth clubs are now boycotting the disaster management training. So really what we are looking at is the need to change the whole narrative around disasters. There's a need to decolonize, democratize, and decentralize. Unless we do all three, we won't be able to. And there's a need for an interdisciplinary approach. And indigenous knowledge and science need to speak to each other. It cannot be, the kind of gap that there is and the kind of knowledge hegemony that there is. There is also a need for, kind of rethinking on the techno-managerial approach to disaster management that we are seeing. Sorry again for extending beyond my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manshi. So I will just quickly say two things. This panel was aptly named. We talked about Himalayan ecology, the fragility and the resilience. And I think in the way that this panel has touched on aspects of adaptation, adaptive strategies, whether it's about, the social ecological system, or it's about individual farmers, it's about communities, risk being passed on to them, and whether it's the market, and Sudha said it, I did not, integration into capitalism in the Himalaya. I think we, and of course, Philippe giving us a bit of hope there, talking about river rights as, something that could potentially foreground, nature over what has and remains a kind of a mono focus on growth and development. And as the first panel set out, it's a hard one to talk about, because as Suresh's paper also spoke about, people's own choices, whether it's about selling Pashmina and other kinds of strategies which are also necessary. I think I've already got the idea for the next conference here, resistance from the ground. I think that would be our next conference. But for now, we can just have a quick question. If somebody has one or two, very quick, please keep it short and sharp so we can have lunch soon and then move on. If anybody has any questions, please direct them to the person and just keep it short.
Thank you. That was quite a broad panel. I was just wondering whether across the four panelists, there seemed to be an underlying possibility that in relationship to people and the environment, that there are multiple viewpoints even among quote-unquote people. And I'm just trying to know whether each of you would like to sort of speak to that diversity and how might that sort of affect the way in which this engagement takes place. Because even in sort of Philippe's work on, if you're taking away from the anthropomorphic view and going back to nature, the way in which the interests of nature and people are aligned seem to be different for different groups of people. It may be more aligned for the kind of people that Manshi was talking about, and less for me sitting in Delhi and getting the benefits of dam development there. So if the panel could speak to the diversity, that I think would be an interesting aspect going forward. Thank you.
Can you reframe it a little bit more? Because I had gone into kind of thinking about something while you were speaking. Sorry.
No, so I was. It just seemed as if that there would be different points among the people who are staying there. I mean, in the Pashmina case, you mentioned about the herders and the workers, and another group which is very well integrated into the capitalism story, and similarly otherwise. So that the views of people and their reactions are not uniform. And so if we could sort of highlight a little bit of the diversity and how different stakeholders are having that, then might be sort of a richer perspective on what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think, you're right. And within even within Himachal, you have a lot of differences. And within a particular valley, there are differences in terms of, who is inhabiting what kind of spaces, like who is fighting for what kind of spaces, who has access to safe spaces, who has access to land. These are, and then access to the markets, access to state machinery. So I think that, but there is a need for a place-based approach. As far as the mountains are concerned, I feel because the impact of it is felt not just in the mountains, but beyond, like downstream. Last year the floods went up to Punjab. It impacted the lands in Punjab also. So there is actually I don't know how it's going to happen, but there is a need for place-based dialogue, but there's also a need for trans-boundary dialogue, or river valley dialogues, upstream downstream dialogues, to bridge urban rural divides. So I think that I don't really have the answer to this, but all I can say is that there's a need to understand diverse perspectives. At the moment, there isn't any space for that. There is no platform. There's only a reaction in terms of and there's very quickly, disaster capitalism, for instance, is something that we see. We have a lot of companies moving in with engineering solutions or technological solutions into a scenario, and that is the only thing that is being publicized. The whole question of governance, or the whole question of these being social and political disasters, is something that remains unaddressed. So I think that right now we are at that space, at that place where we are just trying to change this narrative or the whole perspective on, at least from the point of view of disasters or the crisis that is being looked at. There's also this tendency to blame the locals. I mean, this blaming of people are greedy, people don't have the knowledge, people need to be made aware. I think that there is a need to step back from there also. That is all I can think of right now. But the others, please.
Yeah, I do want to quickly respond because I think the question is particularly perceptive. I think there is the people, right, as a sociologist. So if you look at any one of these communities, the reason I focus on capitalism and I'm not just saying change is because the integration is across from whether it's Delhi or New York to Kullu, right? And as we find in Delhi, in Kullu as well, you find a diversity of perspectives of how people engage with the kind of changes that are coming with the market. There are those who want it, who are more successful. There are those who aspire to it, who are successful, unsuccessful, and there are those who lose out. So the whole idea of social stratification, differentiation, I think is happening across the Himalayas. Caste, I think an important point that Manshi mentioned, I think is a big factor across Himachal Pradesh, across Uttarakhand as well. And you find that kind of differentiation in terms of what people are seeking. So, I mean, if you look at a state like Uttarakhand, there are already people who have access to excellent education over the last 80 years or so, right? You have a lot of them settled in Delhi. So you have that differentiation, and then that also translates often to differential attitudes to what is happening in the mountains. We often find that those who have benefited, people like us even, then go back and are looking for a lost, a kind of protected mountain region, whereas there are those who've never had access to this. So that differentiation, I think, is very, very important. There's one other difference that I do want to mention that I think briefly came up in 3 of our presentations. The fact that a lot of the work on the land and the nature across the Himalayas is actually now being done by migrant labor from other parts of the Himalayas, such as Nepal or some districts of Himachal, and even more and more from Jharkhand and Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. So I think now we'll have to think, that's why I highlight capitalism. I think we'll have to think of the mountains and even place-based very, very significantly in a different way now in the last 2 decades, because these are people who are now living there, using those resources, managing those resources, and who don't have a long association with it, but are likely to be the ones associated with it now. So I think your question actually, is very dense in terms of the kind of differences you will find in people who are living in the mountains. So yeah, I think the reason we hesitated is that there's no simple answer to it.
Philippe, Suresh.
Maybe just a line here. So I think I'll connect to what Sudha said earlier, because risk is individualized. So if somebody wants to venture into a risky proposition, so if something flops, then the blowback is going to be as much. So I think there are other parameters, because what we see here is, if you look at, let's say, the Changthang, wherever, you see people who generally have more holdings are also, they have more holdings in more places, more Pashmina holdings in more places, and they would also have a small dhaba at Debring, and they'll have 3 other kinds of entrepreneurial sort of so I think there is some it's not uniform even within the same community. There are some people who do not really want to change things as they were, so it's difficult to find as to, it's not, probably Sudha can comment on that, but it's not so since risk is primarily, therefore it's upon you, I think it's also connected to your social network and other kinds of capital, other kinds of linkages that exist, because not everybody is picking this up. Of course, in case of Pashmina, it's almost uniform. Now everybody has taken it up. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. So with that, we'll close. Thank you. Please give a big round of applause. Excellent.
Hello. Thank you so much to our Honorable Chairperson and the distinguished speakers for highlighting on such profound topics. Your presentation have surely enlightened our audience, and I'm convinced that it will surely benefit a lot of us who are present here. Thank you all once again for sharing profound insights. Now, I would like to request our Honorable Chairperson, whenever Professor Kaveri Gill, to kindly present the souvenirs and the white scarves to our respected speakers. Professor Suresh Babuji. Professor Sudha Vasanji. Professor Philippe Cullet. Last but not the least, Ms. Manshi ji. Okay.